Now, that just might be the dumbest thing I have ever read.
It's showtime!
So I've been playing Final Fantasy 16 lately, and I've noticed that there's a trend online that I really wish I did not see, and that's that Final Fantasy 16 is being claimed as not a Final Fantasy game. Even recently when I was streaming the game, there was a few people in my chat letting me know that this is just a thing, and I quite frankly don't understand it. I've played every mainline Final Fantasy game excluding 5, and I'm currently exactly 19 hours and 44 minutes into FF16. According to my friend who's finished it, that's about 30% through the game. And from what I just witnessed, that is 100% peak Final Fantasy-ass Final Fantasy. And what I quite don't understand is that the entire basis of the story, from what I've experienced so far, is very classic Final Fantasy. Other than the word fuck, the mature themes in 16 are present throughout the entirety of the Final Fantasy series, especially mainline Final Fantasy. This is editor Pinoy coming in. I was literally just reading a thread about Square Enix strengthening their internal development, and I scroll down to see what people's thoughts are on all of this, and immediately I read this. Both instances of this are just wrong. Please, do not be like this guy. Resident Evil 4 is a Resident Evil game. Well, yes, there's a lot of goofiness, a lot of jolliness that I love and is what really helps make Final Fantasy what it is. You can't deny that there's a lot of depressing stuff as well. Let's talk blood, for example. Minor spoilers for Final Fantasy VII and the remake. I remember the remake being criticized because of the moment when Jenova breaks out. There was just a bunch of like space goo, Jenova cum all over the place, instead of what it was like in the original, which is blood all over the place, on the walls, on the ground, just this long blood trail. I am one of the people that thinks Final Fantasy VII Remake should have done all of that. I would have loved to see bodies all over the place, blood all over the walls, and that's just one example of some pretty crazy stuff happening. I mean, look at any of the other games, you know, Final Fantasy IV, 6, Final Fantasy 6, you know, even 9 has some darker moments that I think people forget, because obviously the game is very jolly. God, when I think about it, like, oh my God, Final Fantasy 6 would be so fucking depressing if it was remade like this, dude, holy shit. Another thing that I want to bring up is that it's an action RPG. It's not the first Final Fantasy mainline to be an action RPG, but there's nothing wrong with it being an action RPG at all, actually. There are lots of great action RPGs out there that have a lot of the deep build systems that people look for, similar to like the job system, you know, games like The Witcher, games like Tales, Persona 5 Strikers is a great adaptation of what Persona 5 was into action. Ys is another great one. As someone who's played basically all of the mainline Final Fantasy games, I've never felt like turn-based combat was what defined Final Fantasy to me. Final Fantasy has always tried something new with every entry. Some obviously more drastic than others, but for me, the biggest thing that I've always loved about it is that they try to keep the series fresh by not being afraid to experiment. One of my other favorite series is Persona and SMT, and I know what I'm getting every time I play a Persona or SMT game, but the reason why Final Fantasy is my favorite is because of that experimentation. When I originally finished Persona 4 and Persona 5, what made me want to go and try out SMT was to see how they adapted a lot of the combat elements that I like about Persona into all of these other frameworks of genre, like Devil Survivor, for example. I want to bring up this article that was published by comicbook.com with the headline, Square Enix Open to Final Fantasy First-Person Shooter. This was an interview with Kitase speaking to Naoki Yoshida, who's the producer of Final Fantasy 16. Since the series began, Final Fantasy has embraced change, offering distinct adventures that can often vary significantly from previous games. That openness to change has been a hallmark of the series and has led to some of the games that are considered the best in the series. Final Fantasy will likely always have elements that keep the games connected, like Moogles and Chocobos. But Square Enix Vice President Yoshinori Kitase has indicated that the company could take things increasingly farther. Based on input from younger staff members, in an interview with Bloomberg, Kitase even said he'd be open to a first-person shooter entry like Call of Duty someday. That'd be fucking wild. My imagination really has its limits, so it's really great to have a new generation of creators on board, Kitase told Bloomberg. That type of change might go too far for longtime fans, and there's already concern that Final Fantasy XVI might already do just that. The game's combat puts a much bigger focus on action than previous entries, which is a far cry from the turn-based mechanics that popularized the series. In that same interview, Kitase says that Final Fantasy XVI's development team has a lot of respect for what came before, but he allowed director Naoki Yoshida, I believe he's the producer, I don't think that's correct, freedom to do what he pleased, as it's risky in that we might be hanging on too closely to past values. To interject here, I think this is why a lot of yearly series, or close to yearly series, can get stale for a lot of people. I know Pokemon sells really well, but look how much the Pokemon fanbase gets annoyed when the game stayed relatively the same. I mean, even though they're doing a lot of changes and new things, people still fucking hate it, but that's a whole nother argument in itself. I can tell you, I fell out of Call of Duty because I basically got tired of it being the same game every single year. The same happened for me with Assassin's Creed. I do want to stress though, that is not a diss to games that usually follow the same formula. Like I said earlier, I know what I'm getting out of a game like Persona. Those games don't come out too often, and when they do come out, I'm usually ready for experiencing what those games do again. There's nothing wrong with sticking to what you know at all. Granted, I also really like that with the Persona spin-offs, they try to do Persona in a different genre. Things like the upcoming Persona 5 Tactica or even the Persona dancing games are really fun or interesting to me just because I can experience a genre or a franchise that I like within a different genre. I just really like trying new things, mainly. Continuing the article, quote, this is from Kitase speaking to Naoki Yoshida. I always tell him, there's no need to ask. You can just do what you want, Kitase told Bloomberg. Whenever he comes to me, I tell him, don't ask me anymore. With any long-running franchise, there's always a concern about falling into a rut, so it makes sense that Kitase and Square Enix are open to exploring different possibilities for future Final Fantasy games. It's probably a safe bet that we won't be seeing a Final Fantasy game where players have to gun down cactuars, but if Square Enix can come up with a concept that keeps the Final Fantasy feeling, it sounds like Square Enix will explore it. And I'm not against that at all. Like I said earlier, Final Fantasy XVI, yes, it is a crazy-ass, devil-may-cry-ass video game, but it's also a Final Fantasy-ass Final Fantasy video game. If I had to be a lot harsher on Final Fantasy XVI, and I have seen people talk about this, to be honest, I think this is the more interesting argument, not
is Final Fantasy a Final Fantasy game?
It's the RPG aspects to the game. Recently, I saw a video, I can't remember if it was IGN or GameSpot, had posted that God of War is more of an RPG than Final Fantasy XVI. Now, I really liked God of War Ragnarok, and I think it's fair to compare them as they're both massive AAA games that are exclusive to the PlayStation 5. And yes, you can come up with your own builds, and it is very RPG-esque in God of War Ragnarok. However, I think personally that they did a little bit too much. I don't really like the gear system really at all in God of War. I actually wish it leaned a little bit more into the action side of it. But this criticism, I think, had me think about Final Fantasy XVI a little bit more with how it handles the RPG elements. So the big thing that Final Fantasy XVI is lacking is a job system. Before the game was coming out, they were very, very upfront about this being a more action-oriented title. And when I saw the game and got to play it for a bit and look at the gear system and the iconic abilities, I always interpreted it, I cannot speak, as Final Fantasy XVI's version of the job system. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous to some people because obviously you can look at Devil May Cry and be like, oh, this is just like getting abilities from the skill tree or whatever. You can definitely view it that way, but as I'm playing 16, and I know this also applies to Devil May Cry, but I do see a lot of people in my chat, including my friends, that tell me that they are interested that I play the game very differently than they do because of how many different ways you can approach a fight with the abilities that are given to you and that you can pick. There's actually one moment I remember where I could get Judgment Bolt, but I went for some other abilities, and a couple people in my chat are like, oh my god, you should, like, why wouldn't you get Judgment Bolt? And then other people are like, why wouldn't you upgrade Limit? And it's like, that to me really reminds me of the conversation around, well, at least between me and my friends growing up, around what jobs we would take in Final Fantasy or what skills we would mix and match. Now, I understand this is not the job system. However, recently I was listening to Frame Trap, which is a podcast by Easy Allies, and I think Michael Damiani put it really well.
I'm going to jump here and say that this game is historically stole the spirit of Final Fantasy. Definitely.
You had
the icons.
You bought gear with
dude.
Gil. Every new town you got to, you got like a new set of gear, and like that's like it was literally
The
just
story,
that.
too. The story feels like a celebration of the entire franchise to me so far.
Yeah.
That's
Spells, like spells, you get cure 2, cure 1, cure 2. It just heals you for more. And Violent 1 does like AoE heals, or maybe it's like that's how spells always worked. Like just got slightly more powerful. Like it's icon abilities. Same thing here, but. The thing I think that people are mean when they're saying it lacking RPG is like there's no job system in this game.
Well,
and I think that's where people who think of Final Fantasy with RPG, like where's my healer build, or where's like my tank build, like stuff like that. And they don't, the icon abilities are how you change that up, but people equate that more with like a Devil May Cry system than a job or an RPG system. And that's just, I think that's it. I think the icon system not going further with like that, I think is what would have maybe satiated a lot of people. So I think hopefully that is like the root of a lot of people's like complaints, like the good faith arguments, is that it's just like it could go further than that.
Sure.
And that's really all.
I highly recommend listening to the full episode. They all make really fantastic points about this topic. I think they could have definitely attuned some of these iconic abilities to fit more of the classic jobs that you are used to in Final Fantasy, like a white mage, for example, black mage, or maybe some weirder ones like ninja. But there are also other ways to go about it to make it feel more like an RPG. A lot of it is just like number goes up by a minimal amount. I think implementing a system like the one from Final Fantasy IX, where wearing gear and using gear in combat can give you new abilities, would greatly change, or could greatly change, how someone approaches their build in Final Fantasy 16. Imagine if different gear would allow you to augment your icon abilities into different directions, on top of the standard upgrade the ability to do more damage like the one from the menu. An example could be like, the Phoenix Rise attack heals you when used, or another one suspends the target in midair. Both of these promote two different playstyles. One of them is far more defensive, obviously. Maybe you trade off in damage for a larger burst of healing. The other one promotes aerial combat. I know those Kingdom Hearts fans would love that. How about some ones for the Flame Wall skill, the one that is like a parry counter to projectile attacks? There could be an augment where the Flame Wall will no longer have a counter attack, but instead grants a barrier that gives life on hit, sort of like a lifesteal thing. That alone would promote, honestly, a completely different kind of build. Now, obviously, I'm not a game developer, so these are probably really shit ideas, but it's just an example that I think could help make it feel more like an RPG. Once again, I have never felt like the genre defines what makes a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. I love 16, I think it's incredible. It might even be my game of the year. I don't know, I haven't finished it yet. I also haven't finished Tears of the Kingdom yet, but it's definitely gonna be one of those two. Well, maybe Armored Core, that game looks really sick too. Either way, please stop the toxicity. There are a lot more other interesting conversations we could be having around this game, and it is okay to like or dislike it for the direction that they're going in. One thing that I will fight back on is, dude, it is a Final Fantasy game. Just kidding, this is not Final Fantasy, this is Naruto. Also, Ben Starr is an absolute gem. I love that man. That was my Clive impression. I'm sorry, it was really terrible. Comment what you think. What do you think about this whole thing? Do you think Final Fantasy, please tell me you think Final Fantasy 16 is a Final Fantasy game. But yeah, what are your criticisms? What do you think they could do to improve the game? Do you want to see Final Fantasy 17 do this? Or are you like me? Do you not care? I don't care what Final Fantasy 17 is. I'm just being real. Like, it could be another action game. It could be a turn-based. I don't give a shit. I just want more Final Fantasy. Really looking forward to Rebirth. Anyway, that is all I wanted to say. Leave a like if you enjoyed, leave a dislike if you didn't. Check out my Patreon. It helps me get videos like this out. You can also come chill with me while I'm editing them live. That's reserved for the $5 tier. And yeah, I will see you all next week. And check out my streams. I've been streaming on YouTube and on Twitch. Bye. That just might be the dumbest thing I have ever read.